Take that hood off, son, this isn't a rap video. Judge Harold Wexler's voice, laced with disdain, cut through the already murmuring courtroom to be the moment 17-year-old Jalen Prescott walked in. The Maricopa County Courthouse in Phoenix, Arizona, was half full, filled with the low hum of whispers, quiet snickers, and the rustle of a few phones being lowered. Even the bailiff struggled to suppress a smirk. Jalen didn't flinch. He calmly pulled the hood down, revealing closely twisted hair and sharp, dark eyes that held an unsettling stillness. His clothes were plain, a faded grey hoodie, black jeans, scuffed sneakers with frayed laces. To anyone observing, he looked exactly like a teenager who should be there for a truancy hearing, not a civil claim. But Jalen wasn't lost. He walked straight to the plaintiff's table, dropped his worn backpack beside the chair, and settled in with a quiet confidence that suggested he'd been doing this every Monday since Christmas. Across from him sat the defense attorney, a man in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, silver glasses perched perfectly, and a smug expression that screamed, "This won't take long." Judge Wexler, now visibly annoyed by Jalen's unbothered demeanor, leaned forward from the bench, a single eyebrow raised in dismissive challenge. "Are you lost, Mr. Prescott?" Jalen met his gaze, his voice steady, devoid of the expected youthful tremor. "Jalen Prescott. I'm here representing my cousin, Ms. Tiana Rowe, in her civil claim, case number 2023 CV7. The courtroom grew even quieter, the low murmurs fading into stunned silence. "You're what now?" Wexler's voice rose slightly, edged with disbelief. "I am her legal representative. Pro se appointment. All documents were submitted and approved last Friday." Jalen calmly reached into his backpack, pulled out a neatly clipped file, and held it up. The bailiff, still side-eyeing him with a mixture of suspicion and growing intrigue, walked it to the bench. Wexler adjusted his glasses, flipping through the papers. Approved. Judge's signature and all. That should have been the end of it, the moment where the absurdity dissipated, but it wasn't. "All right," Wexler sighed, setting the file aside with an exaggerated air of resignation. "We're doing circus acts now. Sure, you watched a few episodes of Law and Order and now you're Clarence Darrow. Fine. Let's pretend this isn't absurd." The audience chuckled again, low but sharp, a few heads shaking in amused disbelief. An older woman in the back row whispered something to her neighbor, and they both chuckled, their mirth a tangible wave of condescension. Still, Jalen didn't bite. He simply opened his own case file, flipped a few pages with practiced ease, and scribbled something on a yellow notepad. The defense attorney, Mr. Lell, stood, clearing his throat, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Your Honor, we're happy to proceed, but for the record, we reserve the right to request a dismissal based on the plaintiff's decision to be represented by a minor." Judge Wexler waved off the objection with a dismissive half-laugh. "Let the boy make a fool of himself. He wanted the spotlight, let's see what he does with it." It was then that Jalen looked up, for the first time since taking his seat, his gaze direct and unwavering. With a calmness that didn't match his age, he spoke, his voice cutting through the lingering amusement. "Before we proceed, Your Honor, may I verify that opposing counsel has disclosed all documentation related to the February 8th lease violation? The emails, photos, time-stamped notices." The room stilled again, the chuckles evaporating. Wexler blinked, caught off guard. The defense attorney hesitated, his smugness faltering. Those weren't included in initial discovery due to timing issues, so they were omitted." Jalen cut in, his voice precise and unyielding, despite being material to the central claim. Wexler looked between them, a frown creasing his brow as the weight of the unspoken began to settle. The defense attorney straightened his tie, suddenly uncomfortable under the judge's new, sharper scrutiny. "I'll allow a 5-minute recess for you to produce the missing documentation," Wexler muttered, his annoyance now tinged with a reluctant curiosity. "Don't make a habit of cutting corners." Jalen sat back, nodded once, and wrote something else down on his notepad. He hadn't even started his argument, but the courtroom already felt different. The silence that followed wasn't boredom, it was curiosity. The air in courtroom 2B, now thick with a nascent curiosity, slowly began to shift. Judge Wexler wasn't done testing him, and Jalen, with his quiet intensity, hadn't even warmed up. The 5-minute recess felt less like a break and more like a collective holding of breath, a silent acknowledgement that the unexpected had just walked in wearing a faded grey hoodie. Jalen sat perfectly still, seemingly oblivious to the stares, his pen idly tapping on the yellow notepad. This calm, however, was no accident. It was a deeply ingrained response forged in the crucible of his upbringing. Jalen was born in South Phoenix, barely 10 blocks from where his cousin Tiana's apartment complex now stood, half boarded up, paint peeling, mailboxes zip-tied shut. It wasn't the kind of place where conversations revolved around civil court, but his mother, Patrice, was an exception. She worked the front desk at a pediatric clinic for 16 years, never missing a shift, a quiet testament to her unwavering discipline. Patrice knew how to stretch a dollar like dough, knew precisely how many hours it took to keep the lights on, the fridge running, and the rent paid 3 days early so the landlord wouldn't come sniffing around. His father had left when Jalen was 5, leaving behind a stack of bills and a half-packed suitcase, never to be seen again. Jalen wasn't bitter about it. He simply learned early on that no one was coming to save them. He was the kind of kid who sat quietly in the back of class, hoodie up, scribbling things in the margins of his notebook. Teachers often assumed he wasn't paying attention. He was, just not to them. His interest in the law began with a spark of anger when his uncle got arrested over a parking violation that spiraled into a bogus resisting charge. Jalen started reading, not just articles, but court transcripts, city ordinances, Supreme Court summaries on Google Scholar. What began as a fierce, protective anger evolved into a quiet obsession. By the time he was 15, he could recite parts of Arizona's tenant laws from memory. At 16, he was drafting sample responses to eviction notices, just for practice. On weekends, while kids from his school were at the mall or trying to sneak into clubs, Jalen was watching public court cases online, breaking them down like a coach reviewing game tape. No one took his self-education seriously, except his mother. She didn't say much, but one night, while folding laundry, she looked at him and said, "You'd make a damn good lawyer." That was it. That stuck. It became real. The day Tiana came home in tears, waving a notice from her landlord, accused of breaking a lease over a noise complaint that wasn't even hers, the theoretical became intensely personal. A neighbor had supposedly filed it while Tiana was working a double shift at the hospital. Jalen knew it smelled wrong. And when she couldn't afford an attorney, he stepped up, not with arrogance, but with a quiet determination. He immersed himself in the facts, researching city records, compiling timestamps, security logs, and obtaining 2 affidavits from neighbors who'd overheard the property manager express his intent to clear out the Section 8 people by the summer. Jalen was 17, with no license, no car, no social media presence. But his binder was thick, his argument solid, and he knew he had a legal right under Arizona law to represent a family member in civil court with proper approval. So he meticulously filed the paperwork, got it notarized, and waited. Then he showed up in court. No one expected much from him. But that was the thing about Jalen. He never walked into a room loudly. He just let silence follow him when he left. Back in courtroom 2B, the silence was starting to feel heavy, and Judge Wexler, still wrestling with his preconceived notions, wasn't ready to let go of control. Jalen, however, was just getting started. He knew the law wasn't enough. He had to prove he belonged in a room that was doing everything to make him feel like he didn't. "Let's keep this short," Judge Wexler announced, straightening the stack of papers in front of him, his voice already tired, not from work, but from Jalen, from the entire situation. It showed in the way he sighed before speaking, in how he rolled his pen between his fingers as if his time was being wasted. "Mr. Prescott, you may proceed. Try not to turn this into a TED Talk." Jalen stood up, no papers in hand, just a yellow notepad and a pen tucked behind his ear. His posture was unassuming, yet it held an unexpected weight. "Thank you, Your Honor. Before I begin, I'd like to address the court's assumption that my presence is a novelty." "Objection," the defense attorney, Mr. Lell, interjected, his voice sharp with annoyance. "Is this an opening statement or a personal grievance?" Jalen turned his head, his gaze calm as ever. "It's context, and I'll move forward. He walked slowly to the front, taking in the courtroom, the murmuring gallery, the skeptical judge, the smug attorney, then focused his gaze intently on Wexler. This case isn't about noise. It's about power. My cousin, Tiana Rowe, is a working-class tenant in a complex that's being quietly cleared of families that don't fit a certain profile. She was accused of violating her lease while she was clocked in at St. Joseph's, 45 minutes away. No evidence. No signature. Just a typed-up report. We're not asking for sympathy. We're asking for facts. The room was still again, a palpable tension replacing the earlier amusement. You could almost hear the creak of the bench as someone shifted their weight. Wexler scratched his chin, his expression unamused, unimpressed, simply annoyed. "And you've got proof of all this?" he asked flatly, the challenge clear in his tone. "I do," Jalen said, reaching into his backpack. He pulled out a thick, tabbed binder, meticulously organized, and handed it to the bailiff. Inside were timestamps from Tiana's time card, a signed statement from Ms. Cheney denying the complaint, and building-wide notices showing a pattern of selective enforcement in one specific section. He even had a printout of an internal email chain, legally acquired through a resident complaint, that showed management discussing a long-term tenant replacement strategy. Wexler flipped through the binder. "Well organized," he muttered, almost grudgingly. "But you realize that evidence alone doesn't win a case." Jalen didn't blink. "Yes, Your Honor. But facts have a tendency to speak louder than sarcasm." The room shifted. Someone in the gallery choked back a laugh, quickly stifled. Wexler leaned back in his chair and stared at Jalen, as if sizing him up for the first time, a flicker of something akin to grudging respect beginning to show in his eyes. "You think you're clever?" "No," Jalen replied, his voice firm. "I think my cousin deserves housing security like anyone else." The defense attorney, Mr. Lell, rose again, clearly agitated. "Objection, Your Honor. His grandstanding." "Overruled," Wexler muttered, cutting him off. He still didn't like the kid, but he was starting to listen. Jalen continued, this time addressing the judge directly. "In accordance with 33 to 1,367 Argentine pesos, tenants have the right to dispute retaliatory or baseless eviction threats. Ms. Rowe was not issued a formal hearing, was not given a chance to respond in writing, and received no copy of the alleged complaint. These are procedural violations that undermine her rights and place her at risk of homelessness for a noise complaint that never existed." He delivered that last part slowly, not dramatic, just steady, plain, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. Wexler didn't speak for a while. The defense attorney tried to shift focus, claiming Tiana had a history of behavioral complaints, but Jalen countered each one with documentation proving they were vague, unsupported, or flat-out false. "You came prepared," Wexler said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Jalen didn't smile. He wasn't there for praise. He just stood there, calm as ever, hands folded, radiating an unwavering resolve. But the hardest part wasn't just making his case. It was surviving a system that expected him to fail from the moment he opened his mouth. The courtroom didn't feel the same anymore. What had started as entertainment for some, a kid trying to be a lawyer, was now an uncomfortable quiet. People were leaning forward instead of laughing. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Jalen walked back to the plaintiff's table and opened his binder again, flipping straight to the back. "I'd like to call my first witness," Jalen said, his voice cutting through the hushed courtroom, a quiet command that belied his youth. "Miss Cheney, apartment 3B. Judge Wexler blinked, surprised. "You brought a witness?" "Yes, Your Honor. She's present and willing to testify." The older woman with the walker, Miss Cheney, slowly stood up from the gallery. She moved with care, her steps small, but her eyes were focused, a quiet dignity in her posture. Jalen offered her an arm as she made her way to the front, guiding her gently. Once seated and sworn in, Jalen approached, his presence calm yet authoritative. "Miss Cheney, did you file a noise complaint against Miss Tiana Rowe on February 8th? "No, I did not," she said without hesitation, her voice clear and firm. "Were you asked to?" "Not directly, but the manager came by earlier that week asking questions about the younger tenants. Said he was trying to clean things up. Miss Cheney's words hung in the air, a subtle but significant crack in the narrative the defense had tried to build. Did you ever observe Ms. Rowe causing disturbances in the building? Never. That girl works harder than anybody in the building. And did anyone from management inform you a report had been filed in your name? No. First time I heard about it was from this young man right here. Jalen nodded. No further questions. The defense attorney, Mr. Lell, stood up, a flicker of panic in his eyes, but Wexler raised a hand. No need, he said quietly, his voice now devoid of sarcasm. Let her rest. The room stayed still as Ms. Cheney, with help from the bailiff, made her way back to the gallery, her testimony a quiet bombshell. Jalen turned back to the judge. We also have time-stamped security footage from the hospital where Ms. Rowe works. It confirms her entry and exit on the date in question. He slid a USB across the table. Her supervisor also submitted a signed statement verifying her shift hours. The courtroom projector flickered to life. The screen showed a grainy hallway, 6:45 p.m., Tiana walking in, hospital badge around her neck, hair pulled back, scrubs on. Next clip, 7:15 a.m., her exiting the same hallway, shoulders slumped, hair messy, exhaustion on her face. Wexler tapped his pen slowly against his desk, his gaze fixed on the screen. The defense attorney didn't speak. He was staring at the footage, arms crossed, jaw tight, his earlier smugness completely gone. When the footage ended, Wexler looked at Jalen. Mr. Prescott, you've made your point. Jalen didn't relax. He stood still. There's one more thing, he said. He pulled a folded letter from his pocket, unfolded it carefully, and handed it to the bailiff. It was from another tenant, Maria Estes, a single mother who'd moved out 2 months earlier after receiving 3 vague notices of lease violations. In the letter, she described the intimidation, the letters, and how the property manager told her, "It's easier for everybody if you just leave." The judge read it silently, lips pressed into a thin line. After a long pause, he leaned forward and rested his hands on the bench. "I've been on this bench for 19 years, he said slowly, his voice tinged with a new, sober reflection. "And I've never seen a kid walk in here with this level of preparation, confidence, and evidence, especially not without a law degree." He looked at Jalen for a long time, then at the defense attorney. "You've got a lot to answer for," he told the lawyer, his voice sharp with newfound disapproval. Turning back to Jalen, he added, "Your case is compelling. More than that, it's airtight." Jalen didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." But this wasn't about praise. It was about the fact that no one expected him to make it this far, and yet here he stood, unshaken. The courtroom didn't clap. No one stood. This wasn't a movie, but the energy had shifted. Even the court reporter glanced at Jalen now, with something different in her eyes, something like respect. The defense attorney, Mr. Brian Lell, stood up, finally, clutching a folder that suddenly felt thinner than it had that morning. "We'd like to motion for a short recess to review this new material," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Wexler shook his head. "You've had weeks to prepare. The footage is dated, the letter is signed, you were informed of the witnesses in the case summary." He tapped the bench with his pen. Motion denied. Continue. Lell walked slowly back to his table, flipping pages as if they'd rearranged themselves. He tried again, this time pushing for dismissal based on procedural irregularities, but the judge cut him off. Irregularities like not producing the lease logs when asked. Wexler said, raising an eyebrow. Silence. Jalen glanced down at his notepad, then turned to look at Tiana. She sat quietly, hands clasped in her lap, her leg bouncing nervously under the table, but her face was unreadable. He leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" She nodded. Barely. Back at the bench, Wexler cleared his throat. "Let's be honest here," he said, his voice losing some of its formality. "This wasn't supposed to be a real case. Not in your mind, Mr. Lell. Not in mine either, if I'm being truthful." Lell shifted uncomfortably. "You thought you'd walk in, call the bluff, and it would be over in 15 minutes. But it turns out this young man did more homework than most third-year associates I've had in front of me." Jalen didn't react, not out of pride, but because the fight wasn't finished yet. "I'd like to call the building manager," Jalen said. "Objection." Lel snapped. "He wasn't listed in the..." "He was subpoenaed," Jalen replied, calmly, flipping to the exact page in his binder and sliding it toward the judge. "Responded via email. The court has a copy of the confirmation." Wexler scanned it, then nodded. "He's in the hallway. Bring him in." The door opened, and in walked a stocky man in his late 30s with a clipboard and an attitude. His name was Phil Hayworth, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He sat down, took the oath, and folded his arms, a picture of defiance. Jalen stepped up. "Mr. Hayworth, can you explain why Ms. Rowe was issued a violation for a complaint that can't be traced to any resident?" "I had a report," Phil said flatly. "From who?" I don't remember the name. It was written down." "Where is it now?" "I don't have it. Might have gotten lost." "You filed a lease violation based on an anonymous claim with no supporting evidence, is that correct?" "Look, I manage over 100 tenants. Yes or no?" Phil glanced at the judge, but Wexler didn't blink. Phil finally, begrudgingly, said, yes." Jalen opened the binder to a printout. "Did you write this email to your regional manager on February 10th? We're going to start removing the problematic ones starting with 2C. They won't fight it." Phil's eyes widened, his bravado crumbling. "That was taken out of context." "What's the context where calling tenants problems is okay?" Silence. "Do you consider working-class tenants a problem?" Phil looked like he wanted to disappear, his gaze darting desperately to the judge, but Wexler offered no escape. "No further questions," Jalen said, his voice quiet, final. Phil was dismissed. As he walked past the gallery, a few people shook their heads. Miss Cheney stared at the floor. Back at the plaintiff's table, Jalen sat down slowly. His jaw was tight now, not from nerves, but from holding everything in. The anger, the frustration, the exhaustion from staying up all night researching rental codes and legal definitions. It was finally coming out, but not in shouts. In facts. But even with the truth on your side, justice isn't guaranteed. Not until someone has the courage to make the room uncomfortable. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. Wexler sat still, chin resting on one hand, glasses sliding down his nose. He looked like he was seeing the courtroom differently now, like the walls had shifted while he wasn't paying attention. Jalen stayed seated, not because he was tired, but because standing wasn't necessary anymore. Everything he needed to say had been said. Tiana whispered, "What happens now?" Jalen didn't answer right away. He just looked at the judge, waiting. Wexler finally sat up straight, clearing his throat, the sound unusually loud in the heavy silence. "This court finds the complaint issued against Ms. Tiana Rowe to be without merit. The eviction process was initiated without sufficient evidence, with procedural inconsistencies, and with what this court can only describe as a troubling pattern of selective enforcement." The words hit hard, not just because they were a win, but because they were real, documented, spoken aloud on record. In addition, Wexler continued, his gaze firm. "The court recommends the matter be reviewed by the appropriate housing authority for possible violations of the Arizona Fair Housing Act." Lel tried to interject. "Your Honor, if I may, you may not," Wexler replied without even looking at him. "You had your chance." He turned toward Jalen now, and his expression had changed. Still stern, still formal, but there was something else under it, a pause, a kind of weight behind his voice that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Prescott," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "I owe you an apology. When you walked into this room, I dismissed you. I saw a hoodie. I saw a teenager. I didn't see an advocate. That was my mistake." Somewhere in the back row, someone murmured, "About time." Wexler didn't flinch. "You have demonstrated extraordinary skill, knowledge, and self-control. You defended your family with dignity. You navigated complex legal standards with clarity, and you kept your composure under pressure most adults couldn't handle." Jalen gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "I appreciate that," he said, quiet, even. Wexler looked down at his paperwork, then back up. This court session is adjourned. The gavel struck once. It was done. No applause, just quiet. Tiana exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks, her shoulders dropping. She turned to Jalen, her eyes full, but not crying. You did it. He didn't smile. He just stood up, closed his binder, and packed it into his backpack like it was just another Tuesday. Nothing flashy. Nothing loud. The clerk approached him on the way out and tapped his shoulder. Hey, she said, her voice soft, tinged with genuine respect. You ever think about taking the bar one day? You've got something. Jalen gave her the same calm look he gave everyone. Maybe, if they'll let me. Outside the courthouse, the air was warmer. People walked past like nothing had happened inside. Jalen and Tiana sat on the bench near the bus stop, the same one where they'd waited an hour just a week ago to file the paperwork. She nudged him with her shoulder. Seriously, thank you. He nodded, watching a car pull up an idle at the curb. Just didn't want to see you pushed out for no reason. But how did you even learn all that? She asked, her voice filled with wonder. He looked down, fiddling with the zipper on his backpack. I had to. Nobody else was going to do it. Tiana didn't say anything. She just leaned back, watching the clouds move over the sun. Jalen finally cracked a smile, not big, but real. You hungry? I'm starving. I got $20. Then you're buying. They both laughed, not loud, but it carried. Because in a system that rarely listens, one calm voice backed by truth can echo louder than a room full of titles. Sometimes the loudest moment is when a teenager in beat-up sneakers proves that intelligence doesn't come with a dress code, and justice doesn't belong only to those in suits. Jalen Prescott didn't walk into that courtroom looking like anyone's idea of a hero. But he walked out with something more powerful than approval. He walked out with proof that knowledge can shake a system, that preparation beats perception, and that when you stand up for someone else, even when you're underestimated, disrespected, and talked down to, you can make people see what they've ignored for years. Judge Wexler saw it. The courtroom saw it. And if we're paying attention, we should see it too. Because every neighborhood has a Jalen, some quiet kid in the back of the room, some kid who watches more than he talks, who reads, listens, and remembers everything. But the world keeps trying to tell him to sit down, to stay in his lane, to wait his turn. What if he didn't? What if we actually made space for voices like his before they had to fight their way in?